Welcome to Reddit Nightmares, where the darkest corners of the internet come to life. Tonight I'll be sharing 5 truly disturbing stories, tales of terror, mystery, and the unknown. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare to be unsettled. Where is everyone? I woke up one day and everyone, absolutely everyone, was or is gone. The internet is up, cable is running, electricity and water is still working, yet there's no one around and I can't get into contact with anyone. No one answers when I call on the phone, and although I can see the messages I've uploaded to social media, I see nothing from anyone else, just old posts and comments from the day before this happened that don't change when I refresh. It's like time has been frozen and all the animals, humans, and even bugs have been taken out of Earth. My name is, who the hell cares? Who is gonna see this anyway? This is the only way to keep from going insane, uploading detailed accounts of whatever's happening to me even though I have no idea if anyone can see it. If they can see it, then the responses are invisible to me because I've tried sending SOS messages to family, friends, and even strangers. Nothing big or unexpected happened before that day a few months ago. I'm a regular girl, working part-time in the city and sitting through college lectures when I'm not manning the counter of my local coffee shop. I live, or lived, with my parents and sister who's still in high school, since I couldn't afford to make it on my own yet. I had just come back from a late night shift, working overtime from open to close since someone called out at the last minute, and I took an Uber back home. I used my spare key to get in the house, ate leftovers from dinner, took a hot shower, and climbed into bed. I had no dreams or weird visions or anything. I woke up to the sunlight coming through my window blinds. I looked at the time on my phone and realized I had overslept. When I went downstairs, I heard nothing but the TV playing an early morning show my mom loved to watch after dropping my sister off at school. Dad's absence could be explained by him going to work, but my mom's was weird. I looked around for her, but when I didn't find her, I didn't freak out. Not until I went outside, but I didn't do that until an hour had passed of me eating breakfast and thinking about the classes I'd missed the day before and that morning. I went out to catch a bus since it seemed Uber couldn't find a ride, and that's when I saw that my parents' cars were still in the driveway. Maybe my sister went to school on the bus for once, that was plausible, but what wasn't was my dad going to work without his car and my mom running an errand without hers. I remember looking into the windows of their vehicles, seeing nothing amiss and trying their cell phones. It rang and ended with their voicemails. I don't think I realized how completely dead the neighborhood was until I walked to the nearest bus stop. Children's bikes were abandoned on the sidewalk, cars that would usually be gone during that time of day because the neighbors worked morning shifts like my dad were present in the garages. There was no sign of life anywhere, no bird song, no butterflies or bees despite the weather conditions being perfect for them. Everything was so quiet, like an empty graveyard. I felt like something was deeply wrong, but I tried not to think about it as I waited for the bus. Bus did not come after an hour and traffic was strangely at a standstill. I began walking, traveling further into the city, and that's when I started to grow more concerned by the second. The city was just as dead as the neighborhood. The bus I had been waiting on was parked at a stop on a busy street, with no driver and no passengers. The wind blew grocery bags like they were tumbleweeds across the road, and the buildings, while all lit up from the inside, contained no people. No employees, no customers, you get the gist. At that point, I would have been overjoyed just to see a squirrel climb up a tree. I reacted just as anyone would. I panicked, and I mean panicked hard. I had an utter meltdown in the middle of Broad Street, hyperventilating and curling into a ball, soaked in my own sweat. There was no one around to help me, to call an ambulance, or even ask if I was all right. It was maddening, and it wasn't even midday yet. I walked all the way to my job, found the cafe open but vacant, and then walked to my college campus, which of course yielded the same results. I sat down in the lecture hall, frantically Googling anything on my phone that may relate to what was happening. All I could think was that the entire city had evacuated and I was somehow left behind or something like that. No news had been posted since yesterday on every website I checked. When I tried to refresh browser pages, the tabs would turn blank, and then an error message would appear. I went back home, which took at least 3 hours of walking, with sores developing on my feet, and got into my dad's car after finding his keys on the key tray in the hallway, a detail I hadn't noticed before. I was crying as I drove around the city, going around cars that were randomly stopped on the street. I drove past the city border, into the next town, which was exactly the same, so I drove to the next town after that one. During my impromptu road trip, I passed by unoccupied airports, the planes all there since clearly there were no flights taking off. The numbers I kept calling and texting were my family and friends and the police. I didn't know what else to do. Eventually I pulled over to the side of the road and sobbed and screamed in frustration. rocking in the driver's seat with my knees pulled up to my chest. I cried until I had no more tears left to shed, and my face was redder than a tomato with snot pouring out my nose like a faucet. This had to be a bad dream, I'd thought, or some kind of super elaborate hoax of which I was the sole victim. Day in and day out, I focused on adapting until I came across someone, and keeping myself sane by watching old YouTube videos and saved Instagram reels. I didn't dare go back home. The lack of the sound of my sister's rude jokes at my expense, my dad's laughter at some stupid sitcom, and my mother's cooking only served to give me a deep depression during which I never left my room so I couldn't be reminded of how alone I was. Instead, I decided to try and make the most of this fucked up situation by traveling, since the world was still functioning, just without the people who made it that way. That's something I thought about a lot. As the weeks passed, I was so scared that the lights would shut off permanently and the water would stop running, so scared in fact, that it made me want to vomit and pass out. But that never happened. Even reruns of TV shows still broadcasted when I turned on any TV. It was really fucking weird. I mean really weird. Who was keeping the electrical paid? Who was tending to the plumbing? Who was broadcasting television and keeping Wi-Fi servers up? The only catch was that I couldn't see anything new that was uploaded past the day I realized I was alone, meaning no recent news, no live shows, nothing. I tried not to think about this too hard because, to be honest, even though I was glad I could still flush toilets after I used them and turn on lights in dark rooms, the thought unsettled me. It made me feel like I was the center of the universe's cruelest practical joke, but I knew a prank of this magnitude was simply impossible. Unless my brain was undergoing some high-tech simulator while my body was in the real world, making me think this was reality when it's actually a program designed as some mentally scarring experiment to see how a human would react when placed in this situation. At least, if that was the case, there was hope of me waking up and returning to normal society, but again, nothing happened the day before all this. I didn't consent to any experiment or scientific testing. And why would these hypothetical government agents or scientists choose me of all people? After the first 2 months, I began to enjoy myself a bit. Not too much, but a reasonable amount, I'd like to think. I know it probably sounds crazy from your end, but if I kept making theories and freaking out about seemingly being the only person on the planet, or at least on the continent, then I would go insane. The hecticness of daily life is something we can all relate to, feeling like a cog in the machine and wondering if life is just one trial of survival after another. You might have thought to yourself, am I just gonna work non-stop until I die? Or am I? Why am I doing this? When can I just enjoy life and take it easy without worrying about the future or bills? Well, when I realized that the upside to humanity being erased, hopefully temporarily, was no rules and responsibilities, I looked at things with a fresher perspective. I would keep traveling until I found someone like me, of course, which was making me lose more hope each day as I'd gone through a few states by this time, but I would at least take a moment to enjoy the peaceful solitude on the way. I've taken the best naps of my life in fields full of wildflowers, went skinny dipping in hot springs, and even went into a restaurant, thawed out the food from the walk-in fridge, and used their kitchen to cook myself gourmet meals to the best of my abilities. So many cars had keys in them, like they were all just sitting there for me to take a joyride in. I did donuts in parking lots, I went into Walmarts and stole video game consoles on which I played offline games on, and I slept in mansions and the best suites of any 5-star hotel. Every door was unlocked, making it unbelievably easy to go anywhere and do anything. One rich person's apartment I crashed in was in a high-rise, and I had an amazing time swimming in a pool on their balcony, which you could see the city miles down below through the glass floor. I always had to have noise playing wherever I went. I kept one earphone in case I heard someone, and listened to music, and I always kept a TV on wherever I stayed. It replaced live human voices for me, it became white noise. I turned my tragedy into serenity, and though I still craved company, at least I could have a decent time until I found help, or woke up, or a scientist pulled the cords connecting my brain to the simulator or something. That feeling of freedom and carelessness didn't last long though. The 3rd month came, and I was driving through the Midwestern region of the country in an RV I'd stolen so I could experience van life like those influencers, but without the risk and the money. I was going to the East Coast because I wanted to stay in a beach house. My cousin liked renting them in Virginia, Florida, and the 2 Carolinas, and I'd always wanted to experience them. Of course, autumn had come and winter was starting, or should have been at least, but it was still warm enough for a dip in the sea. Global warming, I guess. Anyways, night came and I stopped in some random city, choosing an upscale hotel to stay in. Highest floor, biggest room, and a horde of food from the kitchen, all to myself. I slept like a baby, listening to a podcast with a flat-screen TV playing some reality show. The lights always stayed on, and in this case, it was 2 bright table lamps, one on each side of the king-sized bed and a standing lamp in the corner. I woke up in the middle of the night to complete darkness and utter silence. TV was off, so were all the lights. The curtain was drawn over the glass wall, which showed a beautiful view of the city, when I was sure I had left them open to look at the dazzling lights of the skyscrapers. Instantly, I sat up and started breathing heavily, knowing in my heart that my good time was over because the electricity was now gone. I figured I may as well just go back to sleep until daybreak, and then go and steal flashlights from the nearest store for the next night or something, but I wanted to open the curtains first. I guess I must have forgotten that I closed them. I pulled them aside and my heart skipped a beat as I noticed something. The buildings in the city were still lit up. The energy still worked. I scrambled in the dark, pressing the power button on the bedside lamp. Nothing happened, so I felt for the cord, which had been unplugged. I plugged it back in and the lamp turned on, glowing a soft yellow. Upon a quick investigation, I realized all the lamps had been unplugged, and the remote to the TV was perched on the dresser across from my bed, even though I fell asleep with it on my nightstand. Then it hit me all at once. It felt like the breath had been knocked from my lungs, and I immediately started to tremble. Someone had been in this room while I was asleep. And while that should have made me excited to discover another human, it terrified me instead. Because whoever it was decided to fuck with me and leave me in complete darkness, rather than rejoice in the fact they had found another survivor. And if they would truly choose to scare me like this, even though I could very well be the only other human left on Earth, what type of person were they? Had they gone insane? Were they dangerous? Or was this simply proof that all of this was a hoax and they were now messing with me because I had started to make the best of my situation and that was too boring for the cameras? I honestly hope to God the last part was the answer, because while that would be the meanest hoax ever conceived, at least the nightmare would be over. But not so deep down, I knew the prank theory was utterly stupid and wrong. I mean, even if it was possible, no prank would go on this long. I just wanted to believe that over my terrifying reality. After I turned the lights and TV back on, I noticed the door was open, showing the dark hallway. Now, I'm not the strongest or the bravest, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just go back to sleep. I gathered some stuff and used the light of my phone to navigate my way through the now dark hotel building, turning on the lights as I went. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone there?" When I got to the kitchen, I took a big carving knife with me just in case. The dead silence unnerved me to absolutely no end. I searched every room, using keys from the office behind the lobby. It took a while, looking inside closets and bathrooms, but eventually I was able to confidently say that whoever unplugged the lamps in my suite was no longer in the building. I didn't know how to feel about any of it. Half of me wanted to be happy to the point of tears that someone was in this with me, but the other half just knew this wasn't good news at all. I trusted my gut and decided to leave. I got in the RV and drove until daybreak, putting as much distance between me and that place as possible. I became exhausted and parked in the most crowded parking lot I could find so I'd be hard to spot, then fell asleep. When I woke up in the middle of the afternoon, I started a regular day trying to put the previous night past me. I toured this city I'd never been to before and browsed a selection of name brand clothes like Gucci and Prada that I would normally never be able to wear as a broke college student. I looked like a celebrity or some fashion model as I explored, looking for any sign of life. One of the things I missed the most was animals, like seeing someone walk their dog or watching a cat nap in a windowsill. When I returned to the RV at sundown, I was met with a disturbing sight. The door to the RV was wide open and almost everything was out of place. The covers on the bed were strewn on the floor, alongside my clothes and the food and items I'd stolen from stores either for survival or pleasure. The cupboards were open, the faucets were left running, including the tub. And worst of all, someone doodled a smiley face in the dust of one of the RV windows. 2 long vertical lines for the eyes and a curve under them for the mouth. This simple picture put so much fear in me I felt like the world was collapsing. Once again, someone had intruded in on my space and deliberately left a sign that they had been there. More than one person had to be fucking with me, because how did the person from the hotel know where I was? How would they have found me so quickly? There are a million places I could be at. There was just absolutely no way they knew I'd be in this one city in this one parking lot. If there was more than one person, then why were they doing this? What did they want? Why don't they just come up to me and talk like a normal human being so we can figure this shit out together? I think that's when paranoia first hit me. Sometimes I don't think I'm paranoid and sometimes I do. I don't fucking know, okay? I feel like I'm going crazy. Well, that's when I first started having irrational thoughts like, who says it's a human to begin with? And if it is a human, who says they want to figure anything out? Maybe they know more than you do about why the world is like this, and they know it's unfixable, so they're deciding to have their sick fun with you because, let's face it, who's around to stop them? The human brain can be so intelligent but also so masochistic. Mine was torturing me with all these thoughts until I felt like I couldn't breathe. I decided to pack a bag of the stuff I've hoarded since day one and abandon the RV. I can't count how many times I looked over my shoulder as I left to find another car. I felt watched. Once again, I found a vehicle parked with the doors unlocked, small and black, which is definitely more inconspicuous than a hulking RV. The keys were, as usual, inside, and once I got to driving away from that city, it felt like I had a breath of fresh air. However, I wasn't going to keep that car for long because if whoever did that was around to see me get into it, I didn't want them to be able to recognize the car in whatever place I went next. This time, I stayed on the road all day, only stopping to relieve myself at a convenience store and get gas. I tried to appreciate the sights I drove past, but I couldn't stop thinking about the stranger, which is what I had decided to call him or her. It wasn't long then until I would reach the East Coast, but night came and I had to sleep. I didn't want to give up comfort just yet, but I was also extremely nervous that I had been followed, although I saw no other cars driving on the road. Instead of sleeping in upscale hotels, I decided to change things up a bit so I wouldn't be as predictable to the stranger. I considered sleeping in a crappy rundown motel, but I wanted to be absolutely sure they wouldn't know my next move. I parked miles away from my destination, and using Google Maps, which thankfully was still functioning normally, I walked there using back alleys. The sliver of rationality remaining in my brain told me that there's no way they were in that small town without me seeing them following me in a vehicle, but I was taking no chances. I found a big grocery store, took the keys out of a random car in the parking lot that I was going to use the next morning, and decided to gather some covers from the domestic section and crash in one of the back offices of some manager. I locked the door, made a pad on the floor, and turned out the light. I ate a dinner of chips and candy, rather than microwaving or cooking something that would release a smell which would indicate my location. It was hard getting to sleep, but I managed, trying to quietly listen to ambient soundtracks on YouTube with a Bluetooth earphone stuffed in my ear. Sleep snuck on me really. I didn't even feel myself drifting off. I was bone tired, but confident that I left no tracks and was going to be safe. I woke up to music, but nothing was playing on my phone. In fact, my phone had died and the screen was black. No, the music was coming from the overhead speakers. An old tune from the 40s or 50s, one I faintly recognized but wasn't exactly too familiar with. We'll meet again, don't know where, don't know when dash. Someone was playing this over the intercom, and it blared throughout the entire store at an almost deafening volume. I sat there on the floor swaddled in covers, shaking so hard I could barely grip my phone as I wondered if it was even safe to leave that cramped little office. That's when I figured I should have tried to find a security room to crash in, as I'd seen cameras installed on the way in earlier. Maybe I could have spotted whoever this was on the footage, but now it was too late. I made double sure the door was locked and then plugged my phone up to the outlet in the corner so I could at least see the time. I tried to remain as quiet as possible in case the stranger was still there. When I powered my phone on, I realized it was 4 a.m., and I decided I would not try to leave until sunrise, which should have been in a couple of hours. I just had to sit and wait until then. After the song ended, I heard something else play over the intercom. Someone was simply breathing into the microphone. Soft and subtle, but definitely there. The stranger was still there, and I had no idea how they could have possibly found me. I even checked my phone to make sure my location wasn't turned on anywhere, and went through all my stuff thoroughly to be sure there wasn't some kind of AirTag or tracker attached to my clothes or something. My search came up empty. I stayed in that back office for most of the day rather than leaving at sunrise like a sitting duck. I was too scared to leave. Hours passed of hearing nothing, no music and no breathing, but still, I didn't dare move an inch from where I sat on the floor. I was hungry and thirsty. I felt like a child hiding under the covers from a monster in their closet. I felt foolish. Finally, I checked my phone and saw that it was evening time. I had to make a move. I looked for anything I could use as a weapon first, and all I found was a pen with a particularly sharp tip. I supposed I could stab someone in the neck with it. My backpack on my back, I crept out the door and realized that once again the lights had been turned out on me. What? Was whoever was stalking me trying to make it easier to get the jump on me? I removed my shoes so that my footsteps were quiet, my socks padding on the linoleum floor. The only illumination I had was the street lamps outside streaming white, almost ghostly looking light through the big front windows of the store, and the fridges of course. When I got closer to the front of the store where the registers were, I heard something fall off a shelf a few aisles away. Not very far at all from my position. I immediately crouched down and listened intently, holding my backpack so the items contained within wouldn't make a rustling noise from me jostling it around. I heard no other sounds, but I was sure the stranger was still here. There was no way whatever that was had fallen on its own. Tears of fear slipped down my cheeks as I decided to abandon my backpack, deciding the contents of it were not worth the risk of it making a noise or slowing me down if I had a confrontation. I left it there on the floor as I changed directions, moving towards the back of the store to see if there was an emergency exit or back door I could exit from instead. I should have done that to begin with, but I don't tend to think too rationally when I'm scared at times. Indeed, all the way at the back there were a set of double doors I could just barely make out. They were the kind that had this big silver bar in the middle you had to push to open them, and those always made a noise. I braced myself and in one swift motion, opened the doors and slipped outside. Oh my god, it was absolutely freezing cold outside. I did feel the back office get colder throughout the day, but I thought it was because of the AC or something. No, it's because it was snowing. Blankets of snow powdered the air, and the ground was quickly being painted all white. The air felt like I had stepped into a freezer. It had just felt like summer yesterday, and at this time of day the sun was supposed to start setting, but twilight had already fully descended upon the world. The sky was black, not a star could be seen, and the moon was a tiny sliver barely visible. It was barely autumn, let alone early winter. While it certainly gave me a shock, I did not waste a moment thinking about the drastic change in weather. Instead, I made my way around the front and ran to the car I'd prepared to leave in. As soon as I opened the door, all the lights in the store came on, and it glowed yellow like a beacon in the dark. I froze and stared at the windows, my eyes scanning for any movement. I thought for just a moment that I saw a dark figure slip out of sight behind a shelf, but it was so subtle that it could have been a trick of my imagination. I got inside the car, shut and locked the door, ignited the engine, and drove out of that parking lot like a bat out of hell. Once again I cried. All I could think was, why? Why me? Why am I forced to endure this psychological torture? The only other person left here is stalking me, and I think they mean harm to me. Where is everyone? Where did you all go? Why did you leave me here by myself with some fucking lunatic? Why won't any of you answer my messages? Oh, but don't think that's the worst part. The worst part is, it only took 15 minutes for me to run out of gas, even though when I checked the car out the day before the tank said it was full. When I pulled over at a 7-Eleven to get gas, I noticed the tank was already open, as if someone had messed with it, and a tube that may have once been connected to something was sticking out still, dripping with a dark liquid. I hadn't noticed before, so desperate to get away, but someone had siphoned the fucking gas. And there's another fucking smiley face in the back window. It was drawn with a black marker. I checked the trunk and back seat, worried someone had hitched a ride without me knowing. Someone knew I was planning on using this car, and they could have definitely hid in here without me noticing it until it was too late. But they didn't. However, they did leave something in one of the back seats. My backpack that I had left in the store. How did they sneak out of there so quickly to put it in the car, then go back inside to turn on all the lights? It made no sense. No sense whatsoever. There has to be more than one, there has to be more than one. I checked it. None of my things were inside. In fact, there were just pictures of me. Dozens of Polaroids showing me at various times over the past several weeks. Stealing from stores. Eating food. Scouting out cars. And even sleeping. In fact, there was a photo of me sleeping in the back office of that store. How the fuck did they get in? And without me waking up. The door was still locked when I got up. That's impossible. This was too much. I felt the entire world spin around me, but I still got behind the wheel and decided to drive as fast and far as I could. I was dizzy, but I was also so afraid. I almost crashed a couple different times, but I didn't care. I was in pure survival mode. That was a couple days ago. I'm writing this on my phone. I've been sleeping in my car with a knife ever since, and I plan on locating a gun store when I get to the coast so I can arm myself better, although I've no idea how to use a gun. I park my car deep in the woods at night, away from any buildings. Landmarks just make me easier to find. It's not long now until I get to the coast of North Carolina. I plan on getting on a boat and getting out of here. I'm not gonna do anything crazy like sail to another continent, but I'm gonna skirt the coast till I get more down south. I don't feel safe traveling on land anymore. I'm going to keep updating as I go. This is the only thing that keeps me sane. I have hope that someone will reach out or something will happen. I just think, they found me. I was typing and I heard someone. I think it's a man. He was outside my car. I drove into a tree and ran on foot. Help me, God help me, he was running after me. I'm hiding, and if I don't update again tomorrow, please tell my mom I'm sorry. The next story is about a summer unlike any other. One that started with boredom but ended in pure terror. A boy, sent to his grandfather's remote Victorian home, expected the usual dull routine. But this time, something was different. Something was wrong. And by the time he realized it, it was too late. Growing up, I hated the summers. My friends and classmates would start the new school year going on and on about the fun things they did during break, like going to water parks, rec centers, or going to a camp where they told scary stories around the fire and ate marshmallows. I had nothing to share. From the time I was in first grade till the time I was in fourth grade, my stories were boring and mundane. That is, until one year when I was 11 and I came back with a story that was not fun or boring at all, but absolutely terrifying. My summer break sucked because my parents would always send me to my grandfather's, a tradition that started for seemingly no reason. He lived a couple of towns away, his old Victorian house surrounded by farmland, looking for all the world like the place from the first Conjuring movie. There was even a creepy forest of birch trees and a still, murky pond nearby. Grandpa was a tall, skinny and pale man with a bald head that reminded me of a big speckled egg, large hooked nose that reminded me of a witch's, and beady dark eyes that never seemed to sparkle with joy at anything, not even the sight of his grandson who he only saw once a year. He dressed in dull colors all the time, sweater vests and button-ups with these slacks I thought people only wore when they went to church or attended a funeral. He was quiet and clearly didn't like people. He would yell at any visitors and had a beware of dog sign even though he hated dogs. He had no pets, the sign was just to ward off trespassers. Living there for a few consecutive months was torturous for a modern kid like I was. His TV was one of the few left that had a large back and an antenna. Most channels were not available, and whatever kids show I could watch were either super religious, like poorly animated Bible stories, or lame learning programs for toddlers like Coco Melon but somehow more unbearable and from the 90s. The only other things I could do was either read a book, play with the 2 toys I was allowed to bring, or go outside and play. Not before doing my chores though, of course. Each Sunday he took me to a church in the closest town, and throughout the week he forced me to assist him with various volunteer jobs here and there, like at the soup kitchen or handing out resources to the homeless outside. I know that doesn't sound too bad, but being out in the sweltering sun with absolutely no shade, handing out sample deodorants and food cans to the needy, was hellish for a kid who just wanted to watch cable TV and play his Nintendo DS that he sadly had to leave at home. Every night, we prayed before bed and said grace before every meal. The meals themselves were quite bland. My parents were great cooks and all his food was poorly seasoned in comparison and mostly boiled until they took on a pale, unappetizing color. While he wasn't the most affectionate grandfather in the world, I did have the sense that he cared for me. He just was one of those people who didn't exactly know how to show it, I guess. He always asked if my dinner was good after I ate the last bite, and I always lied and told him yes. He would also ask if I wanted to hear a bedtime story, but I always said no and reminded him that I was too old for them, or at least I had thought as much. The summer before I would start 5th grade, something unexplainable happened. He changed. When my mom dropped me off, parking her beat-up Cadillac in the yard and pushing me towards the door, I felt something was off about the whole place. I couldn't put my finger on it, and I remember looking around as Mom and I stood on the porch and she knocked and knocked to no answer and thinking, it's so quiet. I didn't hear birds or squirrels, the breeze we felt earlier was gone, meaning the trees were still, and I couldn't even hear toads croaking by the pond. Finally, Grandpa answered the door, peeking through a crack. He looked shaken. There was an expression on his face I'd never seen before. He seemed paler than usual and his eyes were opened a little wider than necessary. He looked at us as if he'd forgotten that we were coming, as if I hadn't come on the same day every year, as if Mom hadn't spoken to him over the phone a week in advance like she does each time. Dad, are you okay? Mom asked. Grandpa blinked as if coming back to reality. He shook his head and opened the door wider. Sorry, I was only sleeping. I immediately knew he had to be lying. He always got up at the same time and stayed awake all throughout the day until bedtime. He always stuck to a strict routine, and if anything threw him off that routine, he would get angry and become silent for the whole day. Like always, Mom stayed long enough to have lunch with us at the long rectangular dining table Grandpa had. I always thought it was funny how big it was, considering he lived alone. Apparently, his wife, my grandma, died before I was born. Anyway, we ate tuna sandwiches cut into neat triangles with toothpicks spearing olives sticking out of them, drank prune juice, and Mom was on her way. I was prepared for another uninteresting summer, wishing I was riding roller coasters or swimming in community pools like my friends. Things started to get strange a couple of days in. I woke up at 6 a.m. because I was pretty much forced to. He had set the alarm clock on my night table to ring at that time, same as his. After cleaning up and dressing, I went downstairs to watch the old TV while I waited for Grandpa to start cooking breakfast as always. 2 hours in, my eyes glued to the screen, I suddenly became painfully aware of the fact that I couldn't hear Grandpa walking around nor did I hear food cooking. I stood up from my spot sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, and when I turned around, my heart stopped. Grandpa was standing there behind the couch, still in his striped pajamas. He stared at me with these soulless eyes, his mouth partially open as if I was some weird specimen he hadn't seen before, and it disgusted him. How long had he been like that, and why wasn't he dressed yet? He loved routine, so why did he break it? Grandpa? I was concerned for him after I got over the initial shock of seeing him standing there. He was old, but his mind was actually quite sharp. He had never done anything like this before. He didn't say anything, just stared as if looking through me. Grandpa? I said more urgently, wondering if I needed to call someone. More? What? I frowned. More what? He seemed to snap out of it then. His eyes blinked rapidly and he finally seemed to look as if he could actually register my existence. He looked down at himself and started grumbling in frustration. Damn it. I watched him march upstairs to go change. Honestly, I didn't know what to think of what just happened. I got over it pretty quickly. I mean, yeah, it was weird, but I trusted him and figured he just had a brain fart or something. We had a late breakfast, during which he pushed his food around muttering under his breath about something I couldn't make out. I swallowed the runny, poached eggs and got the courage to ask, Grandpa, is something wrong? I just haven't gotten much sleep lately. He waved me away, looking grouchy and not even making eye contact with me. Don't worry about it. Are we doing anything today? I was so bored I was actually looking forward to charity work. No. I'm going back to bed, I don't feel well. Grandpa got up, angrily wiping his mouth with a napkin, and stormed upstairs. I was left there feeling uncomfortable, wondering if I did something to make him angry. He stayed in bed all day, and when I tried to wake him to make dinner when evening came, he told me to make myself a ham sandwich and put myself to bed. Instead, I went outside to explore. I stood by the pond and skipped rocks, wondering if I could use everything that was happening as a way to get out of coming there next year. A creeping sense of unease came over me as I realized, once again, how eerily quiet it was. I didn't hear any bugs, animals, or anything like usual. In fact, there were quite a lot of dead frogs, turtles, and lizards floating along the pond's surface, more than what felt normal. By the tree where an old tire swing hung, a bird lay on its back, rotting next to cracked little egg shells. I tried not to think about it as I searched for more rocks to throw. I wanted to believe I was too old to get scared by such things. What I couldn't ignore, however, was the bubbling sound in the pond. Where one of the rocks I threw landed, far out into the middle, the water bubbled a little. Then, ripples formed a V shape, traveling towards the shore in my direction, as if something under the surface was swimming towards me. I won't give away the region I live in, but we don't have many gators or crocs around here, and judging by the movement of the water it seemed too big to be anything else. I turned and ran to the house. When I made it to the porch, I spared a quick look at the same time as I opened the door. Now, there was a split second between me looking and me running into the house. During that very short time frame, I could have sworn I thought I saw something round poking out of the water, close to shore. It didn't look anything like a gator. In fact, it almost seemed like the upper half of a head sticking out and peering at me, like someone was swimming in that dirty old, still pond. When I went into Grandpa's room to alert him, he was already awake, standing at his window looking down into the yard. His window faced the pond, so I wondered if he could see it, but when I stood beside him and followed his gaze all the way down to the water, I saw nothing. He didn't say anything, he was staring into space again. Grandpa, is there something in the pond? I asked, still breathing hard from running. He didn't answer me. Grandpa, answer me, I'm getting scared. Meat? What? I shook his arm, watching his stoic expression for any sign of emotion. After a second, he turned to me quickly as if only just realizing I was there beside him. In the blink of an eye, his face turned red and veins bulged in his forehead. Go clean the kitchen, boy. I was taken aback by his hostile tone that came out of nowhere, so much so that I said nothing and left to do as he said. He didn't ask if I wanted to be told a bedtime story that night, nor did he pray with me. In fact, all I could hear until I finally passed out from exhaustion was him pacing his bedroom floor aggressively, ranting loud enough for me to hear but not loud enough for me to know what he was talking about. Whatever it was, it had him madder than I'd ever seen him. The next morning, I could hear Grandpa in the kitchen. This made me happy as I got up to brush my teeth, because I thought since he was back into his routine then that must have meant he was feeling better. As I went downstairs, I smiled, hearing him humming a tune to an old song playing from his radio, but my smile disappeared as the stench of smoke hit my nose. Grandpa slammed plates of overcooked food down on the table with such hostility it made me jump. Despite the anger in his actions, he had a small smile on his wrinkled face, not a big one, a simple tiny curl of his thin lips. He didn't once look at me as he started digging into the blackened and charred eggs and grits on his plate with a knife and fork. He ate with such gusto, humming louder and louder between bites, his movements becoming faster and more frenzied. He sliced and sliced with his knife and stabbed with his fork, the sound of the metal scraping against china grating my ears. I watched him, too afraid to ask what was wrong and too afraid to leave the table because I knew the rule was that I had to be excused first and I didn't want to make him angrier. I remembered something then. "Grandpa, we didn't say grace." I flinched when his eyes met mine and all movement on him ceased. He didn't say anything for a moment, but then he returned to his regular self, no creepy smile and no anger, and nodded at me while patting his mouth with a napkin. If anything, he seemed sheepish that he'd forgotten. Good boy for remembering. It's not too late. Go on, it's your turn this time. I closed my eyes and pressed my hands together before reciting the words I'd memorized years ago. God is good. God is great. Thank you for this bountiful food and thank you for keeping us healthy and safe. As I prayed, I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Something felt utterly wrong. I cracked open one eye. And thank you for... Grandpa wasn't praying with me at all, his eyes weren't closed and his head wasn't bowed. His hands rested on the table as he glared at me with such a deep hatred and vitriol that I feared for my life for the first time ever. His fingers rested tensely on his fork, twitching like they itched to grab it and plunge it into my body. Even if it weren't for his expression, something about the fact that he was staring at me like that as I prayed, during a time where his eyes were meant to be closed in prayer with me, made me deeply uncomfortable. What had I done that was so wrong? I started to tear up a little. I got up from the table, no longer caring about the rule. "I'm not hungry, I'm going to my room." He watched me with his unwavering rage-filled gaze, not bothering to respond. His eyes never left me until I turned the corner down the hall. Shutting myself in my room, I tried to think of what to do. I thought of calling my mom using the landline in the kitchen, but would he even let me? I stayed there, reading a book, when I heard slow, methodical footsteps approach the door. I could see the shadows of Grandpa's feet through the crack under it. The doorknob turned, but of course, I had locked the door because I didn't want him to bother me, so he wasn't able to get in. "Grandpa? Please? Please what? Please let him in?" I mustered the courage to defy him and said in a loud voice, "Leave me alone." A beat of silence passed. "I'm not your grandfather, you little piece of shit." My mouth fell open. He'd never sworn at me like that before, not even when I broke a plate or stepped on his bad foot. His voice was low, raspy, and deeper than it usually was. I listened to the sound of him walking away, back down the hall towards his own room. I needed to call my mom. I waited until I was sure he wasn't coming back out anytime soon, and then I crept into the hall and made my way quietly into the kitchen. I remembered Mom's phone number by heart, so I punched it into the keys and held the white phone to my ear as it rang. My hands were sweaty and I felt like every little creak of the house settling was actually my grandfather coming. "Hello? Mom?" I whispered, looking over my shoulder. "Grandpa's acting weird. I don't want to stay here anymore. Can you come get me today?" "Eric, what are you talking about? Your father and I are too busy to pick you up. We planned this summer last year. I think he has some old people sickness or something," I said, trying to remember the term dementia or Alzheimer's at the time. "He's freaking me out. I can't stay here for a whole summer. Please pick me up, I'm scared." "Honey, your father and I are in New York City. We're going to board the ship tomorrow morning at the port. We can't come get you." "What's going on?" "I dunno, he's angry all the time and keeps staring at nothing, and he keeps trying to get into my room." "Baby, he's a grumpy old man, you know this, and wait, trying to get into your room?" "Eric, did you lock your door? You know that's against the rules." "Yeah, I locked it because he's being weird and dashed." I heard a floorboard groan ever so slightly behind me and I turned around, dropping the phone. It clacked against the wall, hanging by the cord. Grandpa was standing in the kitchen entrance, completely blocking the way out, and staring with that empty, dead, slack-jawed expression from before. "Eric? Eric?" Mom's voice came from the phone. The corners of Grandpa's lips yanked up into a demented smile, showing yellowed, rotten teeth I don't remember him having. In fact, I specifically remembered that he always prided himself in his hygiene and meticulously brushed and flossed his teeth twice, sometimes even 3 times, a day. Now they looked like they were ready to fall out, brown ooze dripping from the top row. He advanced towards me, shuffling like a zombie, and I let out a little yelp and dodged him, running out of the way. I turned and realized, my heart going wild in my chest, that he wasn't after me. He simply went over and picked up the phone, slowly bringing it up to his face, his eyes, more dark and cold than a shark's, never leaving mine. "Charlene?" I stood in the kitchen entryway and listened to their conversation, feeling more helpless than ever. "Oh no, no need to worry yourself, my dear. All is fine and well, the boy and I simply had a disagreement." He grinned at me as he saw my face fall. "Oh yes, I'll make sure he behaves from now on, you just relax at home. Okay, take care." He placed the phone back on the receiver and just stood there, in that same position, baring his gnarly teeth at me sadistically as if breathing in my fear. There were no words, I simply turned around and hurried back to my room. I felt his stare burning holes into my back as I did. Once I locked the door behind me, I crawled into bed and pulled the covers up to my neck. The sun was setting outside and I knew it would be hard getting to sleep that night. At around 1 a.m., I found myself starting to drift off finally, until I heard noises in the living room. I couldn't help it, I was too curious, and figured I could be stealthy enough to not be caught out of my room at this hour. I snuck down to the center of the stairway and watched Grandpa in the middle of the dining room surrounded by broken and knocked over furniture, tearing into one of the steaks he'd left to thaw out the previous day. He was naked as the day he was born, and standing there in the dark hunched over tearing into bloody red slabs of raw meat with his rotten teeth like a savage animal. He was even grunting and growling under his breath as he did it. I didn't know what to do or say. I definitely didn't want him to know I was there, and I was afraid to go back up the stairs in fear I made a noise that would alert him to my presence. The air in the house felt freezing cold, when normally Grandpa kept it hot, and there was a bad odor that couldn't just be explained by him not showering in a while or something. It smelled like rot, and it certainly wasn't the once frozen meat. I also noticed that the things that were hanging on the dining room wall had been taken down. The Last Supper painting was lying on the floor with rips and punctures in it, and the holy crosses lying there with it, burned in some places as if he'd held a lighter to them or something. Above all, the detail that stood out the most to me was that he was soaking wet. Now, I hadn't heard the bath running at all, so the only other explanation was that he'd been in the pond. The dirty, wet footprints leading from the slightly ajar front door supported my theory. It was then that I knew for sure that something paranormal may have been happening to him. This was beyond an episode of dementia or something, or at least that's what my preteen brain thought at the time, since Grandpa was extremely religious and would not dare do that to the symbols of Christianity around his house. This had to be related to the thing I saw in the pond. I started slowly making my way back up the stairs. Thankfully, he didn't hear me and I carefully shut the door and locked it. Once that was done, I quietly started gathering my things. I changed out of my pajamas into street clothes I would feel comfortable running in, and packed my backpack so I wouldn't have to return. My plan was to go to the neighbors a couple miles up the road. I never met them, I just saw the house pass by during trips in the car with Grandpa, and saw that it was a family with 2 parents and a couple of kids too young for school. I was going to tell them that I felt unsafe and that Grandpa needed help and give them my mom's number. All I had to do to make this plan work was get out of the house without him noticing me. I waited in bed for a couple of hours until I heard all the noises cease. I wasn't out of the clear entirely though, because Grandpa didn't go back upstairs to sleep in his room. I heard him open the front door and it seemed like he hadn't returned by then. I looked out my window, which faced the side of the yard where the pond started, but saw nothing. I even opened the window a crack to see if I could hear him out there, but I heard nothing. Absolutely zilch, not even crickets and cicadas chirping, an owl, a bat, nothing at all. The world was silent and dead, making me feel like I was the only one in it, the only one aside from my disturbing grandfather. I eventually gathered myself to the point where I could leave the room without passing out from fear. I silently went downstairs, through the dining room, into the living room and out the wide open front door. I looked around while standing on the porch, seeing that the yard was empty instilled me with much needed confidence. I speed walked across the front lawn, and I made it exactly to the middle when I heard the water from the pond burbling. I looked in that direction. Of course, I could barely see anything since I didn't have a flashlight and the moonlight was not very bright at all. I did hear something though. An old man's voice whispered, reaching my ear closely as if carried by the breeze, "Summer isn't over, Eric." I ran towards the road and made a sharp left turn. I could hear him laughing, cackling like a madman as sounds of something emerging from the pond, water splashing, cut through the silence. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs and my lungs felt like raisins. I heard wet feet slapping the asphalt behind me as something followed me, but I didn't dare look. Eventually, the sounds faded away, but I couldn't tell if it was because he stopped chasing me or because of how loud my heart was pumping in my ears. It felt like a lifetime until I reached that house I remember seeing. The lights in the windows slowly turned on as I banged on the door urgently, crying for help. This area was more lively, with fireflies glowing and toads croaking and general nightlife chorusing around me as it should. The mom and dad of that family let me sit on the couch and gave me something to eat and drink as they called my parents and the police. Arguably, this is the worst part of the story even though it takes place after I escaped. When the police came to check on my grandpa, they didn't find him in the house at all. He was in the pond and he was dead. He had been dead for quite a while actually since the night I came, which obviously didn't make sense, but the evidence was there. His corpse was decayed, the process being hastened by the hot summer sun, naked and bloated as it bobbed in the pond. My family didn't sugarcoat this to me at all, being that I kept insisting the police were wrong and that he was alive that night. I brought up the phone call and Mom denied it even more. She refuses to believe that even happened. To the point she yells at me when I bring it up. Dad told me she was drinking that night I called. They were celebrating before getting on the cruise. He thinks I impersonated Grandpa and that she was so drunk she thought I was actually him. I thought she sounded pretty sober though. I think deep down she knows something paranormal was happening, but doesn't want to face it. My mom also told me when my dad wasn't around, that Grandma died by drowning in that very same pond. It confused everyone because she never attempted swimming in it and she didn't have anything wrong with her mentally. Yet, it seemed like she intended to jump in as she'd taken off her clothes and socks and shoes and neatly folded them on the bank. She was found floating in the center with a look of slack-jawed confusion on her face, same as Grandpa years later. Mom believes that she committed suicide because she was unhappy with Grandpa for a long time. She believes Grandpa killed himself too, and my brain made me hallucinate that he was still alive to cope after seeing him drowned. I don't think so though. I think something's really wrong about that place, and that it took its time before claiming my grandpa. You're free to have your own opinions though.